Hi, everybody. We have our final fireside chat of the day. Thank you, Shauna, and the panelists. That was an excellent conversation. Now we're going to have a fireside chat, as you can see from the two chairs on the stage. It's about how to build a culture of inclusion at a time of backlash. What are the most effective ways to advance inclusion and belonging, bringing real systemic change and measurable results when there's waves of corporate austerity and anti-woke sentiment threatening progress? Our featured speaker for this session is Cynthia Owyoung, author of All Are Welcome, How to Build a Real Workplace Culture of Inclusion that Delivers Results. It's a playbook for driving progress in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Cindy has established and led DEI initiatives for 20 years as an executive at organizations across tech, media, and financial services, including Robinhood, Charles Schwab, and Yahoo. She earned an MBA in organizational behavior from UCLA and bachelor's degrees in marketing, finance, and psychology from UC Berkeley. We're giving away copies of Cindy's book today. After the session, you can meet her and pick up your copy, and she'll be signing them. Interviewing Cindy will be David Thigpen. He is the curriculum designer and director of Berkeley's undergraduate journalism program. He's a former Time magazine reporter who reported from the magazine from New York and Chicago, writing about Wall Street, popular music, and Chicago politics. His work has also been published in Rolling Stone and the New York Times. David is also a public policy researcher and a board member with the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. We're very pleased to round out the day with this conversation, so please welcome Cindy and David to the stage.
Hi, everyone.
Okay. Welcome. Welcome, Cindy. Okay, so I have read your book, and you've got a lot of information in there. And I wanted to begin by asking, I know this is your first book. It's fantastic, lots of info in there. So tell us how you came to this work.
Good question. So I didn't actually start out doing HR or DEI. I started my career in marketing. And I did that for about 10 years before I decided I needed to do something that felt more personally meaningful. And I was thinking about what that should be when I decided to go to grad school. And it was during the first tech bust back in the early 2000s. I actually have a brother who is developmentally disabled, and he lost his job as a result of that economic downturn. So I was tasked with finding him another job, and it was really, really difficult. And that experience made me look towards going into DEI because I thought, you know, if he's having such an experience and so much challenge in finding meaningful work, then I really wanted to break down barriers to people like my brother experiencing the same thing. Right? So that's what really pushed me down that path. And then I started to realize that, you know, not only do I have this background where my brother, I've advocated for him my entire life. I have another brother that is gay. I'm the daughter of immigrants, right? My father served in the Air Force. I grew up in the San Francisco Bayview district, which, if any of you are familiar with that, is a primarily African-American neighborhood. And so I have all of these different cultural and influences in my life that really help me empathize with other experiences and have given me this really sharp desire to correct for social inequity. Right? So DEI for me was kind of like the natural evolution of like my entire life experience, and bringing that to bear to really help people thrive in their workplaces, no matter where they come from or what background or abilities they might have.
Fantastic. Now, so a lot of the big companies that you've worked with, they have lots of resources, and the country's changed a lot since 50 years ago, and people of color are more accepted in places where they once weren't. What kind of things did you see happening inside companies that would kind of create the need for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work?
It's as a field, it's evolved so much in the time that I've been in it, right? Like when I first got started, DEI wasn't like a really big thing. It was really about affirmative action and compliance programs, and people were doing it because the government said you had to.
Yeah.
Right? And then, it started to evolve into more of a business strategy and need, where people could see that more diversity inside their teams and inside their companies can help drive innovative problem solving, right? Better decision making, better ability to serve your marketplace and your customers. And so that started to take hold and really kind of expand out company efforts in the DEI space. And then you come in these last 5 to 10 years where it's now evolved to a place where I think people recognize that we all have a moral obligation to correct for social inequities in the world, right? We all want to live in a more just world, and companies are now more and more being seen as places that can affect some of that change, right? Because we have so much more distrust in government and other types of institutions that would normally be playing that role. So I think there's a really a grounded expectation of companies and organizational leaders really driving in this area, not just because it's good for business, and there's so much research, right, that says it is good for business, but there's, we can't lose that moral imperative around it either. So, and I think that companies are still obviously struggling with how to balance those things, especially in a time where talking about DEI can be so divisive, right? And everybody's got very differing opinions on how to do it and how to do it well.
Yeah. So effective DEIB policies are associated with kind of broader success in companies. But you also say that it's not just a numbers game, it's not just a function of hiring. Can you talk some more about that? So in other words, it's not just bringing on a more diverse staff.
Yeah, I know. I think I've seen a lot of companies make this mistake of focusing only on representation numbers, right? And very often that translates into, I have to hire more people from different backgrounds into my company. And so let's build up the talent pipeline for that. Let's build up our recruiting organization to do that. And what ends up happening in a lot of cases is that they haven't actually done the foundational groundwork on their culture to make sure that it's actually an inclusive one, right? One that connects to people, no matter what background or experience you come from, and one in which they want to stay. And staying usually involves being developed, right? Seeing your career grow, seeing opportunities for yourself, seeing role models of yourself in the upper levels of the company, right? And oftentimes companies fall down on that part, where they're not investing in developing people from all backgrounds, where they're not necessarily looking at who's getting promoted, who's getting picked for leadership development opportunities, and how people feel inside your culture, right? If they really feel that strong sense of belonging, or if they're feeling alienated because they're the only one who is a person of color, right, on a team. So all of that ends up creating this revolving door where you might be bringing people in, but they're leaving at the exact same rate that you're bringing them in. So net, you're actually not moving your representation numbers at all. right? So if you're not focusing on all those other aspects of the culture, and that also has to be tied to your values as a company, then you're not going to make progress.
So talk about some of the effective policies that you've seen. You talk about in your book and things you've seen inside companies that can help fix this problem.
Definitely. I think companies that really take a systematic approach to the work, right? Again, when I was early in this work, you saw a lot of companies focus on programs and partnerships, right? Like partnering with different organizations that might be providing you with more of a sourcing pipeline for people of different backgrounds. And that's all great and necessary, but not enough. Right? So I think when you attack it from a systematic perspective, then you're really looking at what are the institutionalized structures, right, that are actually reinforcing our current biases and stereotypes and the status quo that we have today. And those are the things that have to be dismantled. So when you think about hiring, when you think about promotion, when you think about any kind of talent process inside your company, succession planning, talent review, you have to look at it as these end-to-end processes where if you're affecting any part of it, that's going to have impact both upstream and downstream in that process, right? So attacking every phase or every step in that process becomes necessary to actually changing it to be more inclusive. And you'll see that in things like inclusive language, job descriptions, right? Figuring out what are truly job requirements. Do you really need a college degree? Do you really need somebody with X number of years of experience? Or are you really looking at skills and competencies to do the job well, right? You see that in how people don't necessarily raise their hands if they want to be promoted, right? And processes where you maybe rely on nominations for promotions, right? Or self-nominations. Then you're excluding a whole group of people who might be ready and who might want it, but don't necessarily express it or aren't visible in that way. And so changing structures like that are how you actually drive change and progress in the organization.
And these structures are generally kind of hidden, right? They operate, but they're not really on the surface. They're noticeable for people who are on the outside, of course. But can you just talk a little bit more about that? How do they work, and how are they so powerful if they're operating below the surface?
Yeah, so this is where you really, leaders especially, have to challenge your own status quo, right? If you think about how you've traditionally made decisions about who you hire or who gets this particular assignment or a set of responsibilities at the company or who gets to go to this leadership development program, you have to pause and ask yourself, is that the most inclusive way to make that decision?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Have I gotten enough different inputs from different places? I might think that people who do this role have to come from a top-tier university or have 10 years of experience coding in this particular language, right? And actually challenging yourself on those beliefs. Do you really need those things, and can they be learned? Are there corollaries? Do people have adjacent skill sets and experiences that can be just as valid and just as good? Are you really looking for somebody who has done this for 10 years or somebody who's got grit and determination to learn new things and flex and adapt to a changing situation? Because this is the environment that we're in now. Nothing stays the same for long, right? So what is it that's really valuable and going to help people succeed in the role, in your team, and in your organization? And then designing your processes for that, right? I think that's the key to people really being open to driving some of these changes.
Yeah. I'm not speaking for Cal, but just speaking for myself, and having been hired there, I do notice that when a job becomes open at Cal, it doesn't go to an insider necessarily. It has to be open to the general public as well. And I think the purpose of that is precisely as you say, to bring in a broad swath of employees and not just hand the job to someone right there in the office, right, which would tend to sort of reproduce itself. So that's interesting. And the other thing I was thinking about is I know as a person of color, when I go into a company or when I'm interviewing a company, I do consider, is this company full of white males? Only white male, not to pick on white males, but is this company only full of white males, right? If there are people, if there's some evidence that the company has made some effort toward diversity, I think that could attract a higher caliber of employee. Is that safe to say?
I definitely think that over the last 10 years, I have seen so many more candidates asking about what are your company's diversity numbers? Yeah. Who's in leadership? Do you have somebody in charge of DEI initiatives? Yeah. And what are you actually doing to support that, right? And I only see that trend actually increasing over time. So there's definitely like this different expectation of folks coming in to see role models that look like them, right? And not necessarily what's always sort of been historically the majority, right? And demanding, right? Like that we're actually doing something substantive and not necessarily performative, right? And I think that's like a really great thing to see, especially in these younger generations that just sort of expect it. Coming in.
Yes. So I want to talk about some of these specific problems that managers are facing now. So managers who are interested in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging issues. What are some of the problems they are encountering now? And I've got some companies in mind. We can talk about those a little later. Can you talk sort of more generally about why this is a tough time for diversity managers?
Yeah, and I'm sure that's why all of you are still here listening to this, right? We're in a very politically divisive time where any DEI issue can be turned into and has morphed in a lot of ways into a political issue, right? And because these DEI issues are so tied to our identities and our values, and it's a very emotionally sensitive topic area. And I think there are belief systems that are all across the spectrum on DEI, and you're seeing them be voiced much more visibly, and in sometimes in very negative ways. So that makes it actually a very, not just sort of tension-filled time, but like scary for a lot of people to even practice this work, let alone, if you're an employee who maybe identifies in the LGBTQ community, when you think about all the anti-LGBTQ plus legislation happening, right? Like, is it even safe to come out? Right, where you are. So there's so much more to have to deal with now, and in some ways it's gotten so much more explicit, right? I mean, you see people threatening violence in Target stores over the Pride merchandise that they carry, and employees fearing for their safety. I mean, these are real issues that we're all like having to wrestle with and trying to figure out, is that going to happen to us?
So I imagine it's an effective strategy if you're an opponent of DEI B policies, just to create doubt and create threats and a sense of confusion, right? Because that will actually slow down the process and intimidate managers.
Yeah.
Is that safe to say?
I think that's very fair to say.
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen companies who have been committed
Yes.
to DEI starting to walk back some of their commitments, which I think is particularly disheartening. And when we just had, coming out of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, such this wave of support for more in support of DEI. And now that backlash is causing lots of companies to kind of step back, right? Like Bud Light, Anheuser-Busch, stepped away from their commitment with the campaign with Dylan Mulvaney, the transgender.
Could you talk about that? Could you talk about that Anheuser-Busch a little bit more and explain the whole story?
Yeah, so if you're not familiar, Bud Light did a social media campaign with a social influencer who is transgender. And as a result, a lot of more conservative voices began to protest that and targeted Bud Light for boycotts. And so then Bud Light kind of walked back their association with the transgender influencer. And what happened was they actually saw their sales start to slump, right? And then they put two of their highest level marketing executives who were in charge of that campaign on leave.
Wow.
Right. So their commitment to DEI is definitely a question mark, right? For a lot of people who are watching this unfold. And so now there's backlash to the backlash, right? And it's just really like, I don't know how they're going to navigate necessarily through that moving forward.
Yeah, that's an incredible disaster for that company. So obviously they didn't really have a commitment to diversity in the way we're talking about it here. So when pressure was put on them, they thought was the right thing would be to back down to appease part of their audience, but instead they got a negative reaction from another component of their audience. So
that's right.
So that's an example of what can happen if you're really not committed to this process.
Absolutely, and it's one of those areas where I think we all have to think about what are our values, right? And as organizational leaders, what is it that we truly want to stand for, and how do we have integrity with that, right? Because if you are truly committed to DEI, then you have to be able to stand up for that. Right? Even when it might mean that you could lose customers or forego some profit, right? I do think that overall, companies that do focus on DEI do have better financial returns, right? There's been so much research done on this in the past decade, right, and a half, that shows this like high correlation and relationship between companies that focus and really do DEI well and show progress in it, and like their financial statements being on the positive side and not net negative.
Another company, I noticed when Silicon Valley Bank here in the Valley had a run on its deposits, and the federal government had to come in and bail out the depositors. And I noticed on CNBC and a couple of other places in the days immediately afterwards, there were pundits arguing that Silicon Valley Bank's failure was because it had, and they use this word woke policies, which I think is a really vague term. But what were your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that was like a trumped up media story, right?
Yeah.
Based on a lot of false data and assumptions. So it's basically people trying to spin a narrative against DEI that isn't actually based in fact, right? Because when you look at what Silicon Valley Bank did in support of DEI. They were doing what a lot of companies in the industry do in terms of partnerships with different pipeline organizations, right? Focusing on leadership development, having a lot of community work and promoting volunteerism of their employees in that to support marginalized communities. So you look at their numbers and their demographics, again, sort of average for their organization.
Interesting.
Right? And yet having that sort of story spun around this being one of the reasons for their downfall. I mean, it's clearly manufactured to drive more of that wedge.
Yeah. So is it safe to say that what you're arguing is that managers shouldn't necessarily think about DEI work as a numbers game, but in terms of the effect it has on the way employees see identity and it allows them to perform at a higher level?
Yeah, I think what we tend to discount inside organizations and in that whole political conversation, frankly, is that when you're not able to be your true self, your authentic self, and bring all of you to bear in your work, it's hard to be as productive as possible. It's hard to contribute the most that you can to an organization's product, service, evolution, whatever it is, whatever role that you have, because you're spending energy covering for who you are. You're worried about being outed. You're not necessarily thinking about all of the things that you could be doing instead. Instead, you're trying to sort of, protect these facets of yourself that you might be, you might not want to have all out there, right? So I just think that, if we truly want to support our employees and have a successful business, an organization, then you really do have to look at, do you have inclusive policies? Is your culture creating belonging for your employees? And are you attracting and engaging and developing as much diversity in your company as possible?
That's great. So I want to kind of sum up and just talk about some of the common mistakes, and I think you raised a bunch of them, but number one is thinking that it's a numbers game, right? That's certainly wrong. And then not understand, for managers to really need to understand what's going on inside their companies before they actually commit to this, right? And then you said follow-up, and could you talk a little bit, just a second or two more about follow-up in terms of making sure the process works all the way throughout the company?
Yeah, it's about really looking at your talent processes and seeing if they're truly inclusive or if there are points in how they're designed that are actually exclusive and being a barrier to people from different backgrounds. And that can take a lot of different forms, whether that's like you have a homework assignment that takes somebody 5 hours to complete. Well, not a lot of people have that kind of time, especially if you're maybe a single mom who's got kids, right? Or you're somebody who's working 2 different jobs, right?
Yes.
So things like that are things that we have to sort of guard for and look for as we're thinking about how do we make our organizations more inclusive.
Or insisting people come back to the office when maybe they don't live near the office.
That's right. And that's a whole other conversation that we can spend 20 more minutes on, right? The whole return to office and hybrid policies and how, if you think about remote work, it has enabled more people with disabilities to be in jobs, right, that they didn't necessarily have as much opportunity to access before,
Yeah.
right? It helps people of color who may be covering or feel uncomfortable, not being who they are in the office, right? And similar with LGBTQ community, right? And you have the ability to be more productive because you're comfortable in your identity, or you have access in ways that you didn't have before. And so I think the more that we can enable that for people and provide flexibility, especially in scheduling, especially if you've got like dependents that, other folks that you need to take care of, right? The more that we're going to be able to actually make progress in DEI.
Very good. Okay, thank you, Cynthia Owyoung. Thank you.
Thank you.